Well, hey, and welcome to So What? My name's Brendan, and I'm joined here by lead pastor Jason Price. We're excited to be able to share this time with you as we digest some of the content from Sunday's sermon. Today's So What is not live based on some scheduling conflicts. We weren't able to pull it off live this week, but we'll be back live with you next week. So no need to send any questions to the comments or anything along those lines. We will, though, digest as much as we can from the content and talk through any questions that arose from both Jason and I, because actually, Jason, you weren't preaching on Sunday.
I didn't preach.
So we had Grant Agler here with us for the third or fourth time at this point. Grant's a great friend, longtime friend to Jason's, and we always love having him join us here at PCC all the way out from Michigan. So I'd love to just hear your perspective. How did it go? How'd Grant do?
Grant's amazing. I love that guy. He's just so personable and real, and so it's a treat for me, get to hear him, and I think there's a contrast between his style and my style that I think works together. And from the feedback that I get from our church, he seems to be a good fit. He's not so different from us that it's just kind of out there, but there's enough of a contrast that he connects with our people well. So for me, it's always a treat.
Yeah, I agree. Love having Grant out here every time he's here. And just one more note before we dive into some of the sermon from this past Sunday. When it comes to questions that come up on Sunday morning, what we've done in this Philippians book that we've handed out the first few weeks of this series is we've actually given you an opportunity on Sunday on page 2 of notes. There's a question that says, hey, was there anything in the message that you found confusing? And so what is essentially the reason that we have that question in there. We want to make sure that if there are things that are unclear or confusing from Sunday's message, that we help answer those questions the best that we possibly can. So over the next couple of weeks, as you're writing notes down, jotting things down, and answering those questions on Sunday, whether it's during the sermon or rewatching it later, I just encourage you to send in anything you write on question 2, anything that was confusing, hard to understand, or maybe you would like a little more digestion out of, you'd like us to flesh it out a little bit more. That's why we do what we do. We'd love to help answer those questions. So Getting back to this Sunday's sermon, I think Grant did a great job with what I think is a pretty tough chunk of text for many of us to digest, right? Talking about the fear of God is a hard conversation to have, because for many of us, like Grant mentioned on Sunday, it's not a part of our sales pitch. When we are telling our, men's softball league about Jesus, usually we're not telling them about fearing him and our response of fear. Like, that's not a part of the sales pitch when we're trying to evangelize and tell people about the love of Jesus is usually what how we approach that. So I would just love for you to flesh out more when it comes to the fear of God, what a healthy fear of God looks like and how we should approach that part of the conversation.
Yeah, I think it is an important, really important part of this text, right? So just make sure we're all keeping track. We were in chapter 2, starting in verse 12. Therefore, dear friends, as you've always obeyed, and I think we have to make sure that we keep that connection. The fear that he's going to be talking about in verse 13 is connected to the obedience. It is out of a fear of God, a fear of judgment that we should be driven to obey. Now, there is a greater motivator. Love is a greater motivator than fear, and we should grow to whereby that we're actually obeying God because we love God. That should be the natural maturity that we are all striving for. But if you got kids, you know that fear is a right and good and proper way to get them to obey, right? You live not far from a fairly busy street. You've got a toddler in your house. He's not running out into the street out of love for you yet. Yeah. But he should be able to not run out into the street because he fears you.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Because he doesn't know yet all of the stuff, all the terrible things. He doesn't get yet why it's so terrible not to go play in the street. But Dad will be mad if I go run toward the street. And so there's a good, right, proper fear there. And so Paul's utilizing that same mindset. And look, as you've always obeyed, not just when I'm present, but now also when I'm absent, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. that we ought to have a right and proper fear of God. And again, I think Grant alluded to it, that we have so swung the pendulum in our culture to whereby we've made Jesus our buddy. 20 years ago, that was a big thing. There was a buddy Jesus. I don't know if you remember. I'm sure you can Google it up, and there's memes everywhere and T-shirts. There was actually a little dashboard buddy Jesus, and he gives you the thumbs up and smiles, and we treat him like Santa Claus, and God's like just ready to be the good old grandpa just to give us what we want all the time, and it's okay, and don't worry about it. It's not that big a deal. And we've swung that pendulum so far that saying to people, oh, no, you ought to have a fear of God, actually, it sounds weird to our ears. And so I was so grateful that Grant brought that back and said, no, that is biblical. In fact, I want to show you just how biblical. Jesus actually commands us to be afraid of God. A lot of people, it may sound funny, but again, for those of you who are in a life group or are leading a life group, this might be a great additional text to put out on the table this week as you're meeting with some other people. This is in Matthew chapter 10. And Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he's sending them out to preach the good news, which we all love that. That's great. But he tells them, you're going to hit some opposition, and there's going to be some people, and they're going to do mean things, and they're going to say mean things, and you may end up getting thrown into jail. You're going to be handed over to local council, flogged in the synagogue. I mean, like all the bad stuff. And then Jesus says, but don't be afraid of them. It's like, well, that's kind of the things I am afraid of. Then he says this. Do not be afraid of them, for there is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, hidden that will not be made known. What I tell you in the dark, speak in the daylight. What is whispered in your ear, proclaim from the rooftops. And then here's verse 28 out of Matthew 10. Do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one, and that one in our text is capitalized. Be afraid of the one who can destroy both body and soul in hell. Jesus thinks it's proper that we live with a fear. Be afraid of the one who can kill our body and our soul. No matter what you go through on earth, it's temporary. No matter what anybody does to us on earth, it's temporary. So we shouldn't be afraid of that. He says you should be afraid that there is a God over all who is all-powerful and has control not just over your body but over your soul. You should live in fear of that.
Yeah, and I love in that text the comparison of exactly what you just said, the minute power of men on earth and their ability to kill the body, and the sovereign, outstanding power of God over our souls.
Yeah.
I love just the contrast there. Any other notes on the fear of the power of God that you would add?
Yeah, I think fear is most often instinctual, right? You don't decide to be afraid. Like when somebody jumps out from a closet and scares you, you don't intuitively in that moment think, oh, this is a frightening situation, and so I choose to be afraid. You don't do that. It's instinctual. And I think when Jesus comes back, again, Grant used the imagery of like right now, if the sky split and the roof came off and Jesus showed up, we would not have to tell anybody, it's time to be afraid. We wouldn't have to do that. It would be instinctual. You would just do what Philippians 2 says, that at the name of Jesus, every knee would bow and every tongue would confess. It would happen. It would be instinctual. And that's what happened every time Jesus showed off his glory. There's a few texts I think about. I think about Peter was in the boat when Jesus brought in the big catch of fish. And it says when that happened, Peter fell on his face and said, "Away from me, I am a sinner." Peter, seeing Jesus do a miracle, made him recognize his sin and said, "Away from me, I don't deserve to be in your presence," because he caught fish. I think there's another one when Peter, James, and John were there at the Transfiguration, and Isaiah and Moses show up, and Peter pipes up, "Oh, it's so good that we're here. We'll build you houses. It'll be great." And God spoke from the heavens and said, "This is my son. Listen to him." And they all hit their faces. And Jesus had to say, "Okay, it's okay. It's okay now." But they came into the presence of God, and it scared them. Of course it scared them. Mm-hmm. I think about John. Yeah. John in Revelation chapter 1 has the encounter with Jesus. And again, if anybody should have been comfortable in the presence of Jesus, it should have been John. Think about this. John was one of the inner three, Peter, James, and John. He saw everything, was a part of everything. John refers to himself as the one whom Jesus loved. He had a closer relationship than almost anybody. It was John who at the Last Supper was the one leaning against Jesus' chest. It was John who was so close to Jesus that when Jesus is hanging on the cross, he looks out, says, "John, this is now your mother. Mother, this is now your son." He put John in charge of his mother. There was nobody who had a closer relationship with Jesus than John. And yet, in Revelation chapter 1, when John comes face to face with the resurrected Jesus in all his glory, John said this. Where's it at? Verse 17. When I saw him, so he says, I saw him. He had, on his right hand, he had 7 stars. Coming out of his mouth was a sharp double-edged sword. His face was like the sun shining in his brilliance. And John said, when I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. If anybody should have been comfortable in Jesus' presence, it would have been John, but he was not. He had a right and proper fear because this Jesus is more powerful and greater and almighty. In his instinct, I fell as though dead. It wasn't a decision. I didn't bow down. I didn't put one foot back and then drop another foot and then go to a knee and then decide to bow. No. As though dead. Boom. That kind of fear is instinctual. And one day we're all going to experience this moment with Jesus. What we do now is we live knowing that day's coming. And so that knowing that day's coming, we live in a right and proper fear of that day. And that should change how we live. It should actually change our obedience today. And I think that's the whole point of Philippians 2, of what Grant was calling us to, is we should obey out of fear, knowing that this almighty Jesus, we're going to fall down before him as though dead too.
Yeah, and I think that's what I think of when I read these texts, and I think the example of John in Revelation 1 is a great example of someone experiencing in a physical sense Jesus, right, and the fear that was just, I fell on my face as if I was dead. We see that all across the Old Testament anytime someone experiences the glory of God.
Ezekiel 1, there's another one. Yep.
Every single time. So how do we translate that into action, how we live our day-to-day? So translating this biblical text, these ideas that we see over and over again into application. Because again, we say all the time here at PCC, we're not just interested in more information. We want to apply what we're learning, and that's why we take books of the Bible like this in the first place, is to deeper apply them to our lives. The information's fun and it's helpful and it's really good to talk about, but if we're not, again, James says, if our lives are not looking any more like Jesus as a result of this information, what is the use of it? The point, So I would just love to hear from your vantage point, like in what areas of our life, I can think of a few probably, in our approach to sin or obedience and that sort of thing. But just tell me, how does this play out in reality for the people watching and for you and I today?
Yeah. So let's bring it right back to our text. Continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, that we have a part to play in being transformed. It is not that we just sit back and relax and Jesus does all the work. No. Work out your salvation. There's a role for us to play, and we should be doing it with fear and trembling, knowing we are going to stand before the Lord one day. And so as I'm in the Word and I come across commands in the text, do everything without grumbling or arguing. That's the very next one in the text, verse 14. I should take that seriously because he commands that, and I have a responsibility to work out my salvation with fear and trembling. I'm going to stand before him and give an account for my life. Am I taking seriously that the person who's making these commands of me is God Almighty? And so whatever area of your life, Grant used the illustration about pastors who fall into affairs or bullying or greed that ends up getting them kicked out of ministry. They ruin their lives. And it's like, do you not fear God? That should be a driver. That should be a motivator for us to do what he tells us to do. And so,
right. If love is not going to be the motivator, then at the very least we have fear, right?
Exactly. Yes. 100%. Yeah. Love is a better motivator long term. But if you're not there, if love is not making you do the thing that you should be doing, fear better make you do the thing that you should be doing.
Right, and we all go through seasons in which our flesh is not loving. Yeah. So again, I think that's a great. I think of it almost as the second line of defense when it comes to just me and the attitude of my own heart. And thanks for transitioning that for us. I think there's a bit of text here that helps understand why Paul is telling these things to the church, and it has some underlying themes of this contrast that he says we as followers of Jesus should represent. So would you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, verse 14, do everything without grumbling or arguing so that you may become blameless and pure. That's the goal. The obedience, if it's driven by fear or driven by love, should make us blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine like stars as you hold firmly to the word of life. That imagery that he uses there of shining like stars, I shared with it in our Devo for this week that I think came out on Friday, of the time where I was out in the darkness. And you ever been out camping or out away from the city lights and you just look up and you see the stars and they are just so amazing and bright and beautiful, and the only reason you can see that is there's contrast. All of those stars, we all know this, right? If we walked outside right now during the day, all of those stars are still there. We just can't see them because there's no contrast. The goal that Paul's pointing to is there ought to be a contrast. You and me, as followers of Jesus, should shine like stars. And I can't even imagine what that must have. The imagery is so much greater for these guys. There was no electric lights when he's writing this. When they saw the stars, it was always the biggest thing they had for light was a torch. So they saw the stars. They saw the contrast in a way that most of us don't ever get to see. And that's what he's calling us to, that we should shine like stars. That as the world becomes more warped, more crooked, more dark, our light should shine even more. That there ought to be a vast difference between the way that we live our lives and the way that the world lives their lives. And I think sadly there's not enough contrast, if we're honest, for most of us. Most of us live our lives in such a way that we believe things that are crazy, but it doesn't always translate us to doing things that are crazy because of what we believe. We don't necessarily take the risk that he calls us to, live with the sacrifice that he's calling us to, do the hard things that he's inviting us to. And I think that's what he's pointing to, is there ought to be more and more of a contrast between the followers of Jesus and the world. Just like stars in a night sky, there's a stark contrast between looking at a star and seeing the black. that ought to be us. And it's convicting for me because often it's not enough.
Yeah, and I think you hitting on obedience and doing the hard things being one of the values that we hold as a church, as some of our common language, it plays an important role in that. I feel that there's a line somewhere on the spectrum that's just about right, or maybe, somewhere in the middle of the spectrum when it comes to living in a way that's countercultural, right? You can be on one end where you're embracing fully the world and calling it ministry and just trying to get gospel to the people, right? You can be on that side. You can be on the other side, which is so disconnected from reality and not effective when it comes to evangelism or connecting with people that don't know Jesus. And I think that this contrast paints a picture of somewhere in the middle where we are fully obedient and dependent on God, and that's because of the contrast to the world, something that's really appealing to people. People notice. I don't know if you've ever had someone ask you the question or notice something about the way you live your life as an intriguing thing because they're not familiar with it. But I've heard stories of that happen all the time when it comes to people that are obedient. Foster care is a great example of that. Oh, I could just never do that. How can you do that? It's like, it's only by the grace of God. That's our experience. And I know many of the people that call PCC home, that's their experience. So I've always found that spectrum really interesting. And I don't know that there are hard and fast rules as to how to land in the middle, but it's something to strive for.
Jesus is a great example, right? Jesus did not come and become like the world. He was distinct and different from the world. Yet, he was not like, in his day, there was a group called the Essenes. And their goal was, we are anti-world. And they went and lived in the desert. And so they removed themselves from the world to keep themselves pure. Jesus didn't do that. He was not of the world, but he was in the world. I've heard a pastor say it this way, that people who weren't like Jesus liked Jesus. So even people who didn't understand who he was and maybe didn't even agree with all that he taught, they wanted to be around him. There was something compelling about the way that he lived. People who weren't like him liked him.
Which is kind of important for us as people that want to introduce Jesus to the world. That's right. Kind of important.
We have to be close enough to the world that we can reach them, that we can connect with them. But if we're just like them, then we don't have anything to offer them. If we're just like them, if the church becomes like the world, then what's the point of the church? So there has to be a distinction. We have to shine like stars. We've got to be, and again, this is part of the imagery, right? A light in a light room has no value. A star out in the middle of the day, you look up, it has no value. The value of it comes in the darkness. And so when we as a church are grumbling and complaining about the world getting darker, we're missing the point. The point is that we shine like stars in the darkness. We're not supposed to just blend in. We are supposed to stand out. There should be a contrast between us and the world.
And again, I think Paul's telling the Philippian church this for the same reason that we're still reading this 2,000 years later, because it's important and it's really easy to fall into the grumbling and complaining category, right? If you're on Facebook for any amount of time throughout the day, you see a number of your friends doing that on a regular basis and just falling into a cycle of worldly anger and frustration. And I just love the way that this text points out that's not what we're called to. We're called to be the contrast to that.
To the darkness.
To the darkness. What other notes do you have from this text or anything that Grant said on Sunday as part of the sermon?
That's all that I got. I'm ready to dive into the rest of Philippians 2. I thought he did a great job. And I hope that all of our people, all of those of you who are watching, who are here this weekend, take a deep breath and step back and let's just for a moment remember who it is that we're praying to. Remember who it is that is inviting us to follow. Remember that this is God Almighty. It's not our buddy Jesus. And let's walk with a reverent fear of God.
Amen. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. We hope that this was helpful content for you coming out of Sunday's sermon, and can't wait to see you again next week as we dive into week 7 of our study through the book of Philippians. Thanks again. Next week, send in your questions, and we'll see you then.